His name appears in the history books exactly once before Watergate in a footnote, in a declassified memo, attached to an operation most Americans have never heard of. But in the decade before anyone knew who E. Howard Hunt was, he was the man the Central Intelligence Agency sent when they needed something built from nothing. A station in Mexico City. A covert action network across Central America. A paramilitary brigade of Cuban exiles trained in the swamps of Guatemala and the Florida Keys. These were not glamorous assignments. They came with no glory, no public credit, and a standing order that if anything went wrong, the United States government would deny all knowledge of his existence. Hunt prided himself on belonging to the CIA's upper tier. The truth, as his colleagues at Langley knew well, was more complicated. He was not the kind of man Allen Dulles invited to lunch at the Alibi Club. He was the kind of man Dulles sent to do things that couldn't be done at lunch. In the 1950s, the Cold War was not being fought in conference rooms or on battlefields. It was being fought in safe houses, across dead drops, through networks of recruited assets who trusted their American handlers with their lives, and sometimes lost them. The men who built and ran those networks were invisible by design, indispensable by necessity, and expendable when the situation demanded it. E. Howard Hunt was one of those men. This is the story of what he built, what it cost, and what it tells us about the machinery that won, and sometimes lost, the shadow war of the 20th century. On June 18, 1948, the National Security Council issued Directive 10 halves, and the Central Intelligence Agency acquired something it had not officially possessed before, a dedicated machinery for doing things it could deny. The Office of Policy Coordination, the OPC, was authorized from its first day to conduct propaganda, economic warfare, sabotage, subversion, and support for anti-communist underground movements in foreign countries. The authorization came with a specific requirement built into its structure: plausible deniability. Whatever the OPC did, the United States government had to be able to look at it afterward and say, with a straight face, that it had nothing to do with any of it. This was not a loophole in the mandate. It was the mandate. The men who staffed it were largely veterans of the Office of Strategic Services, the wartime intelligence organization that had run networks behind Nazi lines, recruited resistance fighters across occupied Europe, and developed, largely from scratch, the tradecraft that American intelligence would spend the next 4 decades refining and deploying. They were men who knew how to build things in the dark. They had done it before, against a different enemy, in a different war. Now the enemy had changed, and the war had changed, and the requirement had not. E. Howard Hunt joined the OPC in October 1949. The organization he entered was run by Frank Wisner, a Wall Street lawyer turned OSS officer turned architect of American covert action, a man of enormous energy and considerable institutional authority who had built the OPC with a degree of independence unusual even by CIA standards. Wisner took guidance from the State Department and the Joint Chiefs simultaneously, answered to the Director of Central Intelligence only in the broadest outlines, and expanded the organization at a pace that alarmed people who worked inside it. By 1952, the OPC had grown from a handful of officers to thousands, with stations and front organizations across Europe, Asia, and Latin America. The pace of expansion reflected the urgency of the problem. The Soviet adversary the OPC had been created to confront was not a new or inexperienced intelligence service. The KGB and its predecessor organizations had been running covert operations since the 1920s. They had penetrated Western intelligence services at the highest levels. The Cambridge Five had been passing secrets to Moscow since the 1930s, a fact British and American intelligence were only beginning to fully absorb. They had built networks inside Allied governments, recruited assets with a patience and institutional sophistication that the CIA was still learning to match. In the early 1950s, by most honest assessments, the Soviets were winning the intelligence war. What the CIA had that the KGB lacked was American industrial and financial capacity, the ability to fund operations, build front organizations, and sustain influence networks at a scale the Soviet budget could not easily match. What it did not yet have was the accumulated institutional knowledge of how to use those resources effectively, without burning assets, without blowing cover, without producing the kind of catastrophic operational failures that would hand the other side a propaganda victory worth a decade of patient work. Hunt's entry into this world was itself revealing about how the organization functioned in practice. He had served as an OSS officer in wartime China, useful experience.
But his access to the OPC reportedly owed something to his father's relationship with OSS founder William Donovan.
In the meritocratic mythology the CIA cultivated about itself, this was precisely the kind of detail that followed a man through his career.
Howard Hunt prided himself on being part of the CIA's upper tier, writer David Talbot would later observe. But that's not how he was viewed at the top of the agency. That gap between how Hunt saw himself and how Langley saw him would define his career from the beginning to the end. The operational environment he was entering had its own specific pressures, layered on top of the institutional ones. A CIA station chief in Latin America in 1950 operated inside three competing realities simultaneously. There was the Soviet and local communist influence operation, sophisticated, well-funded, and increasingly effective at recruiting inside labor movements, universities, and political parties. There was the American corporate interest, particularly United Fruit Company in Central America, which demanded political stability on its own terms and had extensive relationships with Washington policymakers who could make or break a station chief's career. And there was headquarters culture in Washington, an organization that expected results, provided thin cover, allocated thinner resources, and would, if the results turned out badly, arrange for the record to show that someone else had been responsible. The men and women who served as assets inside these networks occupied a different position entirely. The local journalist recruited to write slanted stories. The labor leader paid to undermine a communist union. The military officer cultivated for information about his country's command structure. These people did not have the option of flying home when an operation was blown. The case officer could leave. The asset could not. That distinction was baked into the architecture of the OPC from the beginning. It never changed. In 1950, Howard Hunt arrived in Mexico City as OPC station chief. He was 31 years old. His brief was expansive and his resources were not. He was responsible for recruiting and running assets, managing influence operations across Central America, and building from scratch an intelligence infrastructure in a region the CIA had barely penetrated. The work required a particular kind of patience, the patience of a man who understood that nothing in covert action happens quickly, and that the assets most worth recruiting are the ones who take the longest to cultivate. Hunt's methods in Mexico City were those of a covert action officer rather than an intelligence collector. He planted false stories in local newspapers about politicians the agency wanted discredited. He cultivated relationships with power brokers, military officers, journalists, businessmen who might be useful later in operations that had not yet been conceived. He recruited promising young men from the kinds of families that produced the next generation of Latin American leadership. One of them was a 25-year-old Yale graduate named William F. Buckley Jr., who had arrived in Mexico ostensibly to study Spanish and work with the agency beginning in 1951. Buckley worked under Hunt for roughly a year before returning to the United States to write God and Man at Yale and launch the career that would make him one of the most influential conservatives of the 20th century. Hunt and Buckley became lifelong friends. Buckley became godfather to three of Hunt's children. The relationship was not incidental, it was characteristic of how Hunt operated, and characteristic of the OPC's broader approach to building influence. You recruited people who would matter, and you recruited them early, and you built relationships that outlasted any single operation. The tradecraft that surrounded all of this work was relentless and procedural in ways that bear no resemblance to the version that appears in fiction. Every asset meeting required a pre-planned cover story, a reason to be in that cafe, on that street corner, at that hour of the afternoon that could survive casual scrutiny and, if necessary, direct questioning. Every document transfer required a protocol, live drop, dead drop, or brush pass, each with its own surveillance detection route, its own abort signals, its own fallback arrangement if the primary method was compromised. A surveillance detection route, the path a case officer walks before a meeting to determine whether he is being followed, might take 2 hours for a meeting that lasts 15 minutes. The ratio was not unusual. The paperwork documenting all of it never stopped. The tradecraft that looks elegant in spy fiction is, in practice, a bureaucracy of paranoia, and the men who maintained it did so knowing that a single lapse, a single moment of carelessness or overconfidence, could end the operation, burn the asset, and, in certain environments, get people killed.
While Hunt was building his Mexico City network, he was also laying the groundwork for what would become one of the CIA's most consequential and most consequentially controversial operations of the Cold War era. Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz had come to power in 1951 on a platform that included land reform, the redistribution of uncultivated land, including holdings owned by the United Fruit Company, to landless peasants. From the perspective of United Fruit's executives and their connections in Washington, this was a communist assault on American corporate interests. From the perspective of the CIA and the Eisenhower administration, Arbenz represented a Soviet foothold in the Western Hemisphere, and a foothold that needed to be removed before it became a base. The original plan, Fortune, had been scrapped by the State Department as too overt. Too many visible American fingerprints. What replaced it was success, and it required exactly the kind of invisible infrastructure Hunt had spent years building: recruited Guatemalan military officers who could be cultivated to withdraw their support from Arbenz at the critical moment, a propaganda campaign disguised as local opposition media, and a psychological warfare component designed to convince the Guatemalan officer corps that resistance was futile before a single shot was fired. The psychological warfare element was the operation's true center of gravity, and it reflected an insight Hunt had internalized from his OSS experience, that you did not need to defeat an enemy militarily if you could convince him he had already lost. In June 1954, CIA-operated radio broadcasts began transmitting fabricated reports of military defeats, phantom columns advancing on the capital, fictional defections of senior commanders, invented casualty figures. The broadcasts were designed to sound like legitimate reporting. They reached Guatemalan military officers who had no independent means of verifying what they were hearing. The Guatemalan army did not lack the capability to fight the small CIA-backed force that crossed the border. It lacked the will, because its officers believed, on the basis of what they were hearing, that the battle was already lost. Arbenz resigned on June 27. Success was declared a success. The operation's architects were not in Guatemala when it happened. They were managing the infrastructure from a safe remove, which was where the men who built these things always were, and which was one of the several facts about covert action that the official histories tended to treat as a procedural detail rather than a moral one. Between Mexico, Japan, and Uruguay, his three major postings before the Bay of Pigs, Hunt built a career as a covert action specialist whose record is, by design, largely invisible. Station chief activities in Japan and Uruguay remain largely classified. What is recoverable from Hunt's own memoir and from declassified materials is that the operational pattern held consistent across all three assignments: recruit assets, build networks, manage influence operations, produce results that could be denied and often were. The psychological weight of sustaining that kind of work, the deception required to maintain cover at every level, the compartmentalization from family and friends, the knowledge that the men and women recruited into these networks trusted you with their lives in a way that had no reciprocal institutional guarantee, none of that appeared in the official record. It appeared, if it appeared anywhere, in the men themselves. In what they carried home. In what they could not say to the people waiting for them there. By the late 1950s, Hunt was working directly under Allen Dulles, contributing to the CIA director's memoir and helping to build what would become Brigade 2506, the paramilitary force of Cuban exiles that Eisenhower conceived and Kennedy inherited and ultimately sent to die on a beach in southern Cuba. Hunt threw himself into the operation with the conviction of a true believer. He had spent a decade building invisible things. This was going to be visible. This was going to matter. The result was the most public intelligence failure in CIA history to that point. On April 17, 1961, Brigade 2506 came ashore at the Bay of Pigs and the operation began to fail almost immediately. The plan had required American air cover to suppress the Cuban Air Force before the landing. Kennedy, unwilling to make American involvement undeniable, withdrew the air support. Cuban aircraft that should have been destroyed on the ground were in the air. They sank 2 brigade supply ships. Without ammunition and without resupply, 1,400 men on a beach in southern Cuba fought for 3 days against a Cuban force that outnumbered them, was better armed, and had the one thing the brigade did not have: a president willing to commit to the fight. By April 19 it was over. More than 100 brigade members were dead. Nearly 1,200 were captured. Kennedy went on television and accepted public responsibility.
In private, he was furious with the CIA, and the CIA was furious with him, and the men who had spent years building Brigade 2506 were furious with everyone. Hunt was among the most furious. He had believed in the operation with a genuine ideological commitment, not merely a professional one. The Cuban exile community he had worked with were not abstractions to him, they were men he had recruited, trained, and sent in. And his conviction, which he would carry for the rest of his life, was that Kennedy's decision to withhold air support had been the proximate cause of the failure, and that the blood of the men who died on that beach was on the administration's hands rather than the agency's. That conviction was not entirely without basis. It was also not the whole story. And the inability to hold both things in mind simultaneously, the genuine political interference and the genuine operational failures the CIA itself had contributed, was characteristic of how Hunt processed most of the significant events of his career. The internal CIA assessment of Hunt's standing in the aftermath was precise and, in its bureaucratic way, merciless. He had been, in the agency's cold internal terminology, indispensable until expendable. His final performance review before retirement recorded a rating of strong, the second highest available. A deputy then downgraded it to adequate, noting that a series of personal and taxing problems had tended to dull his cutting edge. Hunt would later acknowledge that he had come to terms with the fact that he would not get promoted too much higher. The gap between his self-assessment and the organization's assessment of him had been there since Mexico City. It simply became impossible to ignore after Cuba. The colleagues who knew him well were less diplomatic than the performance review. One description that circulated at Langley characterized Hunt as totally self-absorbed, totally amoral, and a danger to himself and anybody around him. The source was someone who had worked alongside him. It was not a minority view. What was happening to Hunt's career in the early 1960s was happening against the backdrop of a much larger institutional crisis. The Bay of Pigs had not simply failed as an operation. It had failed publicly, spectacularly, in a way that handed the Soviets a propaganda gift they would exploit for years. Kennedy fired Allen Dulles. Frank Wisner, who had built the OPC and driven himself into the machine of covert action until the machine consumed him, had already suffered a psychotic break in 1958 and would be dead by his own hand in 1965. The organization that had entered the decade with enormous ambition and enormous resources was being forced to reckon with what those resources had actually produced. The KGB watched all of this with professional interest and considerable satisfaction. The Mitrokhin Archive, KGB files transcribed over decades by Officer Vasily Mitrokhin and brought to the West when he defected in 1992 documents in detail how Soviet intelligence worked to deepen and exploit the fractures the Bay of Pigs had opened inside American institutions. The KGB manufactured disinformation connecting CIA officers to the Kennedy assassination in the years following Dallas. Hunt was a specific target of this effort. Soviet intelligence created a forged letter, purportedly written by Lee Harvey Oswald to Hunt, dated 2 weeks before the assassination, designed to implicate the CIA's covert action apparatus in the president's death and to poison whatever remained of the relationship between the agency and the Kennedy family. It was, in its way, a tribute of a kind. You targeted the men whose exposure would do the most damage. The KGB had been watching Hunt long enough to know that his name attached to something like that would be believed by people inclined to believe it. The human cost of the war Hunt had spent his career fighting accumulated in ways that never appeared in any official ledger. Dorothy Hunt, his wife, who had herself served as a CIA officer before their marriage, who had been his partner in the work in ways that went beyond the domestic, was killed in a plane crash in December 1972. She was carrying $10,000 in cash at the time, money connected to the Watergate hush payments Hunt was managing for the Nixon White House. Their children had grown up knowing their father's profession only as an abstraction, a vague sense of government work, of travel, of a father who was sometimes there and sometimes not and could never fully explain either. The assets Hunt had recruited across 2 decades had their own accounting, which was less abstract and in many cases considerably worse. The CIA's own internal reviews of covert action operations from this period documented failure rates that the public histories tended to omit. In agent penetration operations broadly, roughly 3/4 of the teams sent in were captured or killed. The officers who had recruited them were not there when that happened. They could not be. That was what plausible deniability meant, when you followed it from the NSC directive all the way down to the ground.
On June 17, 1972, 5 men were arrested inside the Watergate complex in Washington, carrying cameras, electronic surveillance equipment, and sequential serial numbers on their cash. One of them had a check signed by E. Howard Hunt in his pocket. Within days, Hunt's name was in every newspaper in the country, attached not to Guatemala, not to Mexico City, not to 2 decades of covert action across 3 continents, but to a third-rate burglary of a political party headquarters. The tradecraft was his. The methods were identical to what he had used for 20 years. The cover stories, the cutouts, the operational security protocols, all of it came from the same playbook Hunt had been running since 1950. The difference was the target. In Mexico City, the men being surveilled were Guatemalan politicians. In the Watergate complex, they were American ones. The machinery did not distinguish. Hunt had apparently stopped distinguishing too. The arc of his career, from the OPC in 1949 to the Watergate break-in in 1972, is the arc of American covert action in the Cold War compressed into a single biography. The skills built for foreign operations turned inward on American democracy. The false newspaper stories planted about foreign politicians became the disinformation campaigns run against domestic political enemies. The recruited assets who trusted their handlers with their lives became the low-level operatives who went to prison while the men who directed them negotiated their own arrangements. The machinery was the same. The target was the one thing it had never been designed to be turned against. Hunt served 33 months in federal prison. He was released in 1977. What the career of an officer like Hunt reveals about the Cold War is something the official histories tend to obscure beneath the architecture of strategy and the grammar of geopolitics. The Shadow War was not primarily fought by gadgets or by genius. It was fought by men operating under bureaucratic constraint, with inadequate resources, in environments where the margin for error was zero and the consequences of failure were borne almost entirely by the people they had recruited to trust them. Eisenhower's CIA, Dulles' CIA, Wisner's OPC, these organizations did things that are genuinely difficult to evaluate with a clean moral ledger. They overthrew an elected government in Guatemala. A government that had been democratically chosen, whatever its ideological complexion, replaced by a military regime that the CIA supported and that went on to preside over decades of violence against its own population. They built a machinery of covert influence that operated with almost no democratic oversight, spending money the American public did not know was being spent, making commitments the American public did not know were being made, recruiting human beings into dangerous situations and leaving some of them there when the political wind changed. They also held a line, however imperfectly and however brutally, against a Soviet intelligence apparatus that was attempting to do the same things with considerably less restraint and no democratic tradition to answer to at all. The honest accounting of what the CIA's covert action apparatus did in the 1950s and 1960s requires holding both of those things at the same time, which is precisely the kind of moral complexity that official narratives, on every side, are structurally disinclined to manage. E. Howard Hunt died in Miami in January 2007. He was 88 years old. His obituary in the New York Times ran under the headline, "Agent who organized botched Watergate break-in dies at 88. 20 years of serious covert action, a decade of station work across 3 countries, an overthrown government, a failed invasion, a paramilitary force built from scratch, a career spent doing the things the United States needed done and could not acknowledge, fit in the subordinate clause." The man who had spent his best years building invisible things was remembered, in the end, for the one night his tradecraft failed in plain sight. Which was, in a way, exactly how the work was supposed to go. The invisible things stay invisible. The visible ones define you. Hunt had known that since Mexico City. He had spent his career on the right side of that line. Until he wasn't.